Actually, we're 30 seconds early. Just wanted to make sure this thing worked, so we didn't fail again. Let's see. Are you on your LinkedIn by chance?
I am not on my LinkedIn, but I can go over there and take a look.
Good idea. There we go.
Are we up?
We're live, rock and roller. All right.
Awesome. Good to see you there.
Good to see you, Edward in Africa. Hi, this is Christopher Janot. Thank you for being here. I'm with my dear friend, Edward DeMarco, Edward in Africa, who is in Nairobi presently. I'm dialing in from Lusaka, as you know. Edward, how are you?
Doing great. Trying to stay warm here. We got the winter encroaching in East Africa. I guess it's coming your way too. Maybe it's already there. But I'm good. And it's good to see you.
You look good too. And this is our Africa Megatrends 2023 Redux, because we tried to do it on Africa Day and our streaming service flatlined. And so here we are, having mastered the technology. And I'm really excited about this episode because I think you and I both have spoken to a lot of these issues. They're so timely and relevant, especially for investors and geopolitical strategists, thought leader, mind gods like you.
Something like that. I don't know. I may need a drink now.
I think we should start where we are. So go for it. Where are we?
Good. Well, now is this, I love history. Should I do a little history for us just to start us off?
To give us some context, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, because we are still in May. I know we didn't hit the exact date, but we tried. But we're still in May, and May is the 60th anniversary of newly independent African countries actually coming together to form their own organization. The Organization of African Unity no longer exists, but it's kind of morphed into the African Union. So it was a good start. And I think it's always good to go back and sort of what was the world like back then? Because we've come pretty darn far when you think about it. John F. Kennedy was in the White House, U.S. president. In Paris, and this surprised me when I researched it, in Paris, Charles de Gaulle, who was the wartime leader of France, was the president in 1963. And we also had Nelson Mandela in hot water in South Africa, not yet on trial, but about to be put on trial in the famous Rivonia trial that's going to lead to him being imprisoned for 27 years. So that's still to come. And we have up in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, an Emperor Haile Selassie, at that time really the most famous African for a lot of reasons, going back to the fight against fascism. But he's very revered at that time, and he's looked up to by all these liberation leaders, independence leaders, from Ghana to over to Kenya and all throughout the continent. And he's rounded up as and his full title, by the way, includes he's the Lion of Judah. He's got a very long title as emperor, but he's very respected by Kennedy as well. And he's rounded up 32 African countries newly independent from either Britain or France to form this Organization of African Unity. So, a lot of stuff was happening. It was happening in the context of the Cold War, which was quite hot at that moment. It was only 7 months since the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the world nearly went to the nuclear war between the U.S. and the Soviets over missiles that the Russians had put into Cuba. So that was where we were starting from. There were still countries yet to be independent. Kenya was not going to become independent until December, but they'd gotten self-rule in May from the Brits, and there are other countries that like Zambia that were still in the waiting area, if you will, to get to full sovereign independence. So, CJ, that's the end of my little history lesson. But just to kind of put us, on a trajectory there that takes us to 2023 and straight into our mega trends and what we're seeing for the future.
I think that actually really is good context, because it kind of demonstrates, all these colonial powers sort of exited right around the same time. Some struggled a little longer than others, But the relevance of that is that we're sort of smack dab in the middle of a bunch of actually quite young democracies. Some more progressive and liberal minded than others, and certainly some wobbliness here and there. But we'll get into that a little bit later. But since we're talking about megatrends, I actually thought, so that we're not glib for no reason, it would probably make good sense to remind ourselves what a megatrend is. So the characteristics of a megatrend, according to the German Development Bank, who had put out a white paper on megatrends in Africa, as you do, spell it with a K because you're German. Characteristics number one, longevity. A megatrend is in for the long haul. The second characteristic is ubiquity, so it's ubiquitous. The third trend is third characteristic rather is that it has global relevance, which is certainly true of what we're going to be talking about here. The fourth characteristic is complexity. And the fifth characteristic, according to the German Development Bank, is irreversibility. So there you go.
We're not going back. We're not going back.
We are not going back. So,
CJ, we probably should introduce ourselves, right?
We always forget to do that. So thank you for even mentioning that. Go ahead, Edward in Africa. Tell us about yourself.
Yeah. So I'm again today. I'm sitting in Nairobi. I'm just so you know why I would have anything useful to say about Africa. Other than the fact I've been here for about a dozen years. I used to sit on an editing desk in Washington doing international politics coverage, U.S. diplomacy, United Nations, and that sort of thing. And of course, Africa figures in a lot of those areas. And so I sort of started kind of at the high level, dealing with Africa back in Washington before I actually moved to Africa and took an unexpected turn into international development. I was an advisor, basically a strategist for the U.S. Agency for International Development in Ethiopia and later in Zambia. I have a book out on my experiences in Ethiopia, Last Days in Naked Valley. You can find that on Amazon around the world. And now I do a lot of international kind of development strategy, consulting, and that sort of thing, and contribute to things like this to kind of offer some insights and perhaps share some of my experiences of the past years.
Well put. And, you made me realize that I actually approach it from a low level as opposed to you from a high level, because so Christopher Janot is my name. I'm an investor and an entrepreneur. I came here probably about 10 years ago and really started from the ground up with a small pocket of American investors. We had kind of looked at some international markets and decided that Africa was a place where we could have a good run around the bases. And so we've landed here in Zambia and have done a lot of projects in the bush and trickulated to the cities. And now we're sort of a pan-national investment firm with projects in hotels and retail centers and green metals and all sorts of stuff. And so it sounds to me like we've both done the hard grafting. We both live here. I'm based in Cape Town, but I spent a lot of time in Lusaka. You're in Nairobi at the moment. And so hopefully that gives us some credentials to talk about what we're going to be talking about.
I hope so. At least we're going to fake it till we make it. No, we actually have, the reason we're here is we do feel like as two Americans, we have a lot to say and to share. Of course, we have a lot of questions on our own, and we'll be wanting your inputs out there as well. And your questions will be very helpful. But one thing I wanted to, we're going to kick off with, I guess, CJ, and we'll talk about is that we're coming out of the pandemic. We're coming out of this period. 3 years ago, the world was in complete turmoil as they were dealing with the beginning of COVID-19, and Africa was no different. And yet we've now come out of the pandemic, and as tough as it was, and as horrible as it was for those who got very ill, and many millions who died, there were in Africa some positives, frankly, that came out of this that were unexpected. That the pandemic, and we're beginning to see this now as we're coming out of this pandemic 3 years, that it accelerated some positive trends and unexpectedly. And one of those is the internet. It was just happened by coincidence almost that Africa was just getting its bandwidth vastly increased right before COVID. And the number of Africans on the internet had tripled since 2015. So it just, fate made it the perfect moment for Africans to have to jump online, whether it's for business or school, because of all the COVID lockdowns. But coming out of that, that's accelerated things probably by years. And I'm wondering, what does that look like to you?
Well, this falls into the bucket of some of the mega trends that we're going to talk about. But just from a practical point of view, as an investor, who was trying to open a hotel in the middle of COVID, it was remarkable. It was a remarkable shaking of the chessboard where all the pieces fell, and you kind of got to put them back in new places while nobody was looking, so to speak. And we're starting to see post-COVID things come back to, at least in the hospitality business, come back to pre 2019 levels. But it's been a slow ride. It's noticeable, but it's been a heavy lift. However, there are a lot of other things that are being exacerbated. From power to currency fluctuations. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world. And the one thing about a place like Africa, which will have a lot of foreign debt and whatnot, is that it can often be the dog wagged by the tail, so to speak, in many ways. But as there's so many things that we can discuss, and I think that a good way to look at the trends, the mega trends happening right now, is a lot of people have their different takes on what the mega trends are. But again, some of the thought leaders have kind of talked about the 6 major megatrends happening in Africa as climate change, population growth, a big one is urbanization, migration, the rise of tech in the information society, and of course, the advance of liberal democracy. And any one of those could be, a multi-interview kind of discussion. But I think the one that really excites me is urbanization. I'll just take a moment to chat about why. So Africa is the fastest growing continent in the world demographically. The average age is about 18 and a half years old. There's roughly, if I recall, I think there's probably about 600 or 700 million people on the continent at the moment. But by 2050, there'll be over 1 billion people. And what that means is that 1 in 4 people on the planet will actually live on this continent. And so the implications for culture, for consumption, for democracy, for brands, it's just shocking, the scope of it. And the weight and growth of influence of the continent will actually have a lot of impact on the rest of the world. And within the context of that, there's a lot of cool things happening. Like we, as developers, we pay a lot of attention to the movements of demographics, because it implies growth, and investors want to be where the growth is. And it's funny because urbanization, on a positive level, leads to a lot of efficiencies in terms of infrastructure. I know there's data points about healthcare and education, all of these wellness factors being amplified with urbanization. And it also creates a lot of opportunity for investment, and it makes the grid and energy sector a lot more efficient. But it also comes.
Yeah, and there's and a lot of people may not realize that, you think of like the big cities, Lagos, Kinshasa, Nairobi, Johannesburg, et cetera. But there's actually these clusters that are emerging, that are stringing together the big cities and the smaller cities. And there's 6 of them, according to a report out last year by the African Development Bank. There's 6 of them, 3 in North Africa, 3 in Sub-Saharan Africa. One of them is just to the west of where I am, or it begins just to the west of where I am, in Kisumu, Kenya. It's kind of the southern end of this one that arcs around Lake Victoria and ends up in Kampala. It's about 36 million people in that corridor. And another is down where you are in the Johannesburg area. I don't know the exact population density there. The third for Sub-Saharan is where you'd expect it, and in near Nigeria, going from Accra over to Lagos and up into northern Nigeria, and that's like 80 something million people today. And of course, that's going to get a whole lot bigger. But I jumped on your line there. So go
Oh, that's all right.
go back to the city. Go back to the street there and,
Well,
and
so
tell me what you're about to tell me.
6 million people in it. And the growth of these mega cities is quite fascinating, because I was sharing with you earlier. I looked at a list of African cities, and the amount of cities that are over 3 million people that you have probably never heard of. Cities like Kano or Douala or Ibadan, Abuja, Bamako, Ouagadougou. That's 3 million people right there. Lubumbashi, just to the north of us. Mbuji Maya. And so, Mbuji Maya, sorry, I'm going to get some hate text in a minute.
Where's that?
That's in, that's DRC. Yeah, that's what I thought it was. Is it DRC?
Okay.
A giant country, by the way, that I happen to spend a little bit of time in. So on the urbanization front, man, I think that's actually a really strong growth metric for Africa, and it's going to have a lot of positive implications, especially now that there are so many infrastructure issues on the continent, as vast as it is.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the trend lines, people like to be in a city, whether you're like in the heart of the city or you're kind of in the outskirts and you're kind of in the sort of the transition zone into the rural areas. People understand there's more choice, there's better healthcare, schools are better, you're more likely to have electricity, and all those factors are getting scaled up. And to the point you're making, that a lot of people may not realize as well that there's something like 1,000 of these smaller cities. I don't know the exact population range, but Kisumu, I just mentioned in Kenya, is one of them. And Kisumu actually hosted a conference about these sort of second tier cities, which are hot. They're hot right now because they generate about 40% of Africa's GDP. And there's something like 36% of the urban population of Africa. So there's a lot of people living in these smaller cities, it can be very creative. They're very innovative in the way they go about offering services, transportation, and things like that. And that's why a lot of people are flocking to those places.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's actually a great investment strategy, because a lot of the offshore investors will go to the place, the airport that's nonstop from wherever they're from. But the secondary and tertiary cities is where there's a lot of growth and a lot less competition. One of our lines is that we build retail centers for the likes of some big box companies like Massmart and ShopRite, Massmart being a subsidiary of Walmart. And they want to push into these areas because it's less crowded, and that's where the growth is. And everyone wants the best sites as these sprawls happen. There's another component, which is that, it's a youth demographic, and they don't really want to be in the rural area anymore. People, Africans are aspirational. It's highly competitive because there's still not enough jobs for everybody, which also makes it highly entrepreneurial. And I think in that way, the digital boom, the tech boom, this information revolution that's happened in Africa has been like a particular blessing, because in a lot of ways, they went straight from the agrarian age and jumped the industrial age and went into the information age, skipping all that messy stuff in between. And you see this in a lot of sectors, not least of which would be mobile money, but many other sectors. And I think I shared with you this factoid from ages ago. The rise of smartphone, the uptake of smartphone technology in Africa represents the fastest uptake of a technology in human history, including electricity, telephones, what have you. And so you've got a very empowered youth demographic, and they're very facile with smartphones and payment systems and payment gateways, and everything happens in the palm of your hand in Africa.
And what's interesting too about that is I think this rising generation is looking a little bit less to their governments to drive the agenda, and a little more to as you say, the technology or the sharing with their peers, or looking, they jump on YouTube and they're suddenly, getting insights from some other part of the world. Just the way they handle money, in Kenya, go ask any person in Kenya who's younger than 30 if there's any cash in their wallet or in their, in their
There
purse.
isn't.
And there isn't.
Yeah.
They're completely on a mobile phone using a mobile payment system. Here it's called M-Pesa, which is a Kiswahili for mobile money. And that's also spread to other countries. That was basically invented in Kenya. And it enables lots of things. It enables things out in rural areas, like women to get solar energy, a little solar panel that they can light up their accommodation, light up their house in the evening, so that they can, read. They can maybe jump on a tablet computer, or just listen to the radio, whatever. It enables electricity to get into places that that the grid does not reach. So and that's just one of many, many uses that are emerging because of the spread of mobile money. I did want to go back, CJ, just before we leave COVID, COVID in the dust. We all want to leave COVID in the dust, don't we? There's been another theme that's emerged from that, and it's self-reliance, or at least more strongly defined self-reliance, because Africa did not have the vaccines and had to basically wait for other countries to deliver them to many of the countries in Africa, because Africa had to go and borrow $26 billion from the International Monetary Fund, and also seek other resources to essentially to pay for the lockdowns, and is still having to deal with the debt that piled up because of that, in part. And then on the agricultural side, because of disruptions in supply chains that then got deepened because of the war in Ukraine, you're seeing some really interesting instances where the policymakers are like, we want to be more self-reliant. We don't want Africa to simply have to be waiting for someone to show up with some kind of development aid for these things that are essential for the population. Ethiopia, I just wrote about on LinkedIn on Sunday, is basically filling its wheat supply gap, because wheat is in high demand there, through a very innovative strategy they pursued in the middle of COVID, which was to get more irrigated farmland under cultivation for wheat. And they're closing that gap to the point where they can export some of that wheat. So that's an example of in the food security realm where that's taking place. And I think we're going to see more of that breaking out in the financial side, where this debt crisis in Africa is probably going to drive more governments and I think citizens to want to pay more for their own services, rather than borrowing it from some European investor or from China. So those are positive trends. It's going to take a little time to play out, but I just wanted to highlight that sort of self-reliance thread that's coming out of COVID, and I think is going to be really, really benefiting a lot of people because of that focus.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Ed. And I think actually that to bring it back into my space as an investor, it also represents tremendous opportunities for investors, because what we're looking at right now is, everything from, the meme that you hear a lot in Africa is to keep the processing and the value addition on the continent. And that makes sense, right? Because that's where all the value creation is. I mean, I was in a conversation earlier with some guys from the Swedish embassy, and they were talking about how, for instance, the Chinese take massive amounts of ore and just ship this unprocessed copper ore to China and do the processing there because it's cheaper, without any inference to the fact that they're sending the ore like 10,000 miles around the world, and it's not concentrated. So you're basically sending dirt to get processed in another continent, right? And I hear about this, so as you know, the Americans, as well as the Europeans and a bunch of other stakeholders in for instance, minerals, are really keen to get the processing happening here and to make it sustainable. But I also see that like in pharmacology, for instance, where, probably a lot of our listeners don't realize this, but what happens when, Panadol, the pain medicine, comes to Africa is the same thing that happens when Coca-Cola comes to Africa. They don't make it in Atlanta and send it here. They make it here with all the ingredients. And they do that with pharmacology and so many other things. And these represent huge investment opportunities for offshore as well as onshore investors. And it's just almost in any category you can think of, from life sciences to data centers to wellness. In fact, I've got a whole bucket list of sort of investment categories that are sort of positioned to be homegrown categories on the continent, and well, they should be, because one of the things that speaking of positive demographic trends is that there's going to be a demographic dividend here on the continent, because the consumer class, so long as the middle class here in Africa stays at parity with India and continues to grow, and there's enough job creation, is going to really drive the economic growth of the continent. And that's an exciting story, and also one that is not being lost on a lot of the offshore economies. Like, whereas China and Russia, for instance, are sort of in the midst of a demographic collapse, as is South Korea. This is going to be an engine of wealth creation for the continent.
It ties in nicely with something else that actually launched in the middle of COVID, which is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is meant to take advantage, I think, of that demographic shift, and the idea that will lead to more industries, more essentially business in Africa, and that African countries will start trading with each other much more intensively. Because right now, that's one of the things that stands out, is that Africa is doing a lot more trade with countries outside of Africa than with other with your neighbors, basically, because of a lot of trade barriers, tariffs, and other things that are getting in the way. So that is at least the beginning. Of course, it's going to take time for this thing to actually work, but the fact that I think every country in Africa has now signed on. Maybe there's one left to ratify the agreement, but basically Africa has signed on to this, and there is now a secretariat set up in Accra for the free trade area. And the world's really looking to that as an accelerator. They really, if you talk, as I've been talking to people in the past few months, from India to Indonesia to Japan, they're really seeing that free trade area as kind of like a signature move by Africa that's going to set the stage for some really good things to happen between now and into the 2030s. Now, it's going to take a lot of political will to get there. That's no question about that. But it is one of the things that people think is going to really help the young people coming up to get those economic opportunities, because it will be driving, in theory, it'll be driving more growth within Africa.
There's so much upside in that space that you're talking about, because I remember when I first got to Africa, we were in I think we were in Nairobi or Dar es Salaam, and we needed to go to Accra, and the fastest, cheapest way to go there was to fly to London. I just skip. We wound up flying to Addis Ababa. We had to spend the night there. I had like one of the great party nights of my life. And then they put us on a plane, having paid for the hotel, and sent us to Accra. But it really struck me how like everything's not rationalized yet. For instance, the tariffs, the landing tariffs that certain countries will put on other airlines to protect the national airline, or the lack of routes and whatnot. And as that gets rationalized, there's going to be a big dividend in terms of access and cost.
I sure hope so, because I just flew from a few weeks ago from Nairobi down to Namibia, which has got to be one of the most expensive tickets that you can buy in Africa, because there's just very little competition, and it's far. It's 3,000 kilometers or so. You got to go through Johannesburg. For a few $100s more, I could have flown all the way to the United States and back. And it's just an example of how that's another huge area. It's a capital intensive area, but I think Africa is going to need like a JetBlue at some point in the next 10 years. It's something that's nice discount carrier. I'm told by an airline industry source who said, well, you got to understand there's not a way right now in a regulatory way to run an airline like that in Africa because things are just still too balkanized in terms of, like you just said, to protect national airlines. But hopefully somehow that'll be addressed and we can start to get airline competition for real into Africa. It's really desperately needed.
I think you're the right person to talk to this other mega trend, which is the shift towards peaceful transitions of government and the sort of the march towards liberal democracy in Africa. Again, Africa's a compendium of really young democracies, and some of these countries kind of fall out. Like we've had a series of really good indicators. For instance, I'm in Zambia. We just had a very, very rough election. Well, it was about a year and a half ago, where it looked like there was some concern that the election would not be transparent and free and fair, and it was. I think we could look at Tanzania after the death of President Magufuli. His Zanzibari vice president, who is a woman, you probably remember her name. I don't. She took over. And has been seen as a strong advocate.
Samia Suluhu Hassan.
Yes,
Samia Suluhu Hassan.
There's probably one or two more. Certainly, we could look at Ramaphosa and Zuma, but also we've had some kind of missteps as well, haven't we?
Uganda. Well, we just saw things going kind of haywire in Sudan, and that's really troubling because of the size of Sudan. We should though give a shout out, since it just happened yesterday, to the new president of Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa, Bola Tinubu. Congratulations, President Tinubu, and to your team. Best wishes, because running Nigeria's got to be one of the toughest jobs on the planet. And it's got every variety of challenge surrounding it, but nonetheless, that's an example of there was a peaceful transfer of power. The former president handed over, and we saw that in Kenya as well last year with an election that was, I think, basically declared free and fair, and William Ruto took over as the president of Kenya. And yeah, so I think, if you look at Freedom House, which is one of the organizations that kind of rates the degree of freedom and participatory democracy in Africa, it's going to look pretty bleak when you go to their map. It's only about 6 or 7 areas that are green, considered totally free. Ghana, I think, is one of them as an example. And you got large areas of Africa that are partly free according to their indicators, and then you got a lot that are just not free at all. Places like Eritrea that are kind of grim, and other countries that are in conflict situations. But I don't think that map really reflects fully what's going on. Like you just pointed out, Zambia. That was the youth vote in Zambia that carried the day in putting Hakainde Hichilema into power, and I think you're going to see the youth vote expressing itself more and more. I think it even was a factor in Nigeria as well. So, we got these places in the Sahel, for example, which are in conflict, with places like Burkina Faso, which have gone through coups recently, and it's worrisome because you've got more stable countries to the south, like Ghana, that you want to make sure do not have problems with those kind of insurgencies and everything. But there's a lot more positive going on at the ground level than people realize. I agree. That was a long-winded way of saying I agree.
Yeah. I think that's important because a lot of what you'll hear about Africa is usually the bad stuff. The truth is, it's 54 independent countries. Many of them are investable. All of them have different metrics. If you're an investor or private equity or a development bank or a brand, and you're looking for growth, then these things are going to be of great interest to you. Because the one thing that investors are always looking for is stable regulatory environments, a stable currency, and a growth market that is business friendly. And you've seen more and more of those. And with President Hichilema's election here, here's a former Grant Thornton principal, Grant Thornton being one of the big 5 accounting firms like KPMG.
He knows money.
He knows money, and he knows how to run things. And it's great to get somebody with technical skills to actually run a country in the driver's seat. It's good to have somebody driving who knows how to drive.
Right.
So I see a lot of positive trends, and I'm also kind of seeing a lot more, especially certainly in the regions in which I operate. I'm seeing a lot more appreciation for the need for stability, and I think that's going to drive a lot of growth. As a matter of fact, in Zambia, they've just developed a new REIT law, real estate investment trust, which is kind of it's a modern instrument that's kind of run of the mill in places like the United States. But when you come to a market like this that has all this growth, and they just never got there, they just never had a REIT, and you can just imagine the opportunities that represents in terms of offshore investors coming in and having regulated entities that they can drive for yield in these emerging markets.
It's got to raise the comfort level, right? To know that something like that, the country's sophisticated enough to have something like that, and it's available.
Very much so. And I'll tell you something else that's quite interesting on that very subject, which is so I got a meeting at 6:00 tonight with one of the people over at the Security and Exchange Commission, because we're doing some work with them on REITs and property funds and whatnot. And the meeting tonight is actually about their ESG mandate. So SEC actually got all the listed companies, which are mining companies and InBev and brewing companies and whatnot, and said, PwC has just put out this ESG report. We're pushing it out to you. Get with the program, because this is now important to us. And
should we just pause and mention what this is? This is not an EKG for your heart. This is ESG, which is environment, social, and governance standards. Basically, this is another thing that got really sped up, I think, by a lot of things that happened during COVID. But essentially, emerging international standards around trying to do better by the communities and by the context in which you're operating. It's coming into the mining industry, for example. Anyway, let me stop there. You can tell us more.
No, thank you for the jargon busting. That's appropriate. And anyway, so there are a lot of stakeholders from the embassies to the World Bank and of course public companies that are here, and they're all here. I mean, that's the thing. Whether it's Coca-Cola or InBev or Diageo or Ford or Walmart, they're all here, and they care a lot about this kind of stuff. And so Africa seems to be going green, and it's very, very much on the lips of everybody right now.
Well, if there can be some serious traction on this in Africa, it's going to be a huge deal. The U.S. has been pushing this hard, and joining with its allies in Europe, particularly the big industrial countries, Germany, the UK, Japan, and trying to see if, because a lot of people, they get that picture in their mind, and it's vivid, and it's really horrible, of these people clawing in the mud in Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, to get at these various minerals, particularly the I'm sorry, I'm totally blanking out on the cobalt. Which you gotta have, or at least currently you gotta have in electric vehicle batteries, I believe. And so people see that, and it's just like, oh my God, that looks like something out of the Middle Ages or something, a medieval horrors of the industrial age. And so that's the extreme end of this kind of thing. But basically, it's to promote a better way of doing business and better way of doing investing that's a little more holistic. And the green metals play is huge, right, CJ?
It is huge, and you'll have known from our previous conversations that some pretty big players are coming here. Uh, Elon Musk has a nickel mine or an investment in a nickel mine up in DRC, and he just made an investment in graphite active anode materials in Tanzania. I hear he's looking at some stuff in Zambia, and this is all in the apparently there just isn't enough of these critical green metals to supply the transition to a green economy. And so there are a lot of these metals are not that rare. I mean, there's plenty of lithium in Australia. I think they do half of the supply of the world, in Chile and whatnot. But these markets represent a fantastic opportunity because of where they are. And because this particular area, Zambia, DRC, and Southern Africa, has so many of these things, from the rare earths, the graphites, the manganese, to the cobalts, to the coppers, to the chromium, the rhodium, and iridium, and
it's like your high school chemistry
exactly,
table of elements come to life.
Yeah, and so that there again, just a fantastic opportunity, and there is to echo an earlier part of the conversation, a concerted effort to bring the processing to these areas. I've seen a couple of deals where they want to make soldering wire out of tin and tungsten, I think, and then there's a copper wire project, and they all involve millions of dollars of processing plants and stuff. But that's an investment bucket, and there seems to be unlimited requirements for these materials. So it's high yield, high reward, moderate risk probably.
So are you going to be driving a Tesla soon in Lusaka?
I saw Charlie Munger on TV the other day, and apparently Berkshire Hathaway just invested in BYD, which is a company I never heard of.
Which is the Chinese automaker,
biggest biggest electric car maker in the world that you never heard of. I mean, you heard of it, but you know what I mean. Anyway, so no.
BYO I've heard of. Bring your own, but not BYD.
All right, so let's see.
Yeah, so well, can I mention one other thing, because it kind of ties to what you just said, and that is, and it's a mega trend, and it's been a mega trend, I guess, for like 4 billion years, and that's the sun. Because Africa's got the most solar energy potential in the entire planet, and is just beginning to tap it. Countries like Namibia, where I was just a few days ago, are going to be solar powers, basically, literally, in the world in terms of energy.
Yeah.
And they're going to then use that to break apart the water molecule. We remember that from our high school chemistry.
Yep.
Put some electricity in there. You get your hydrogen out of it, and that hydrogen is in high demand, particularly in Europe. The Germans want to take that hydrogen from Namibia once it's produced there, and then bring it by ship, liquefy, just like you liquefy natural gas today, and replace, I think, natural gas in their industries or whatever they're using in steel making today that generates carbon. They want to get carbon out of their industry. So they've cut a deal with Namibia for long-term supply of this stuff. In fact, the Germans are going around the world and tying up different deals on this, but particularly in Africa. There's also solar just to generate electricity, not to be used to break up water for hydrogen, but you've got Morocco on the sort of left side of the map and Egypt on the right, both with massive solar investments going purely to feed electricity under the Mediterranean into Europe. They're like ignoring the rest of Africa. See, we're not paying attention to you, but the North Africa is really emerging as like the solar energy, electricity power of the world, or it will be. There also is a plan to do this down in the Sahel, which is to the south of the Sahara Desert. This is something the African Development Bank's pushing hard on. I don't know how much progress they're making, but they want to create like a huge solar belt there with just generating that electricity. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that because that's a 4 billion year old megatrend, or whenever the sun was formed. I don't know. I think it was like 4 billion years ago.
Well, very, very topical since we're all suffering from, actually Zambia's been pretty good for the last few days, but rolling blackouts here, as you know,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
of sort of disrepair of some of the dams, some of the hydro electricity available. Obviously, in South Africa, it's a massive issue. Where Cape Town, where we are, it's 10 to 12 hours a day of blackouts. So if you're in the generator or the inverter business, you are kicking ass in Southern Africa right now. But again,
or diesel.
Yeah, exactly. But as an investor, there you go again, opportunities. In fact, we have an MOU from a South African group that wants to put a like 900-acre solar farm down at a property near Siavanga. So whether it's wind or hydro or geothermal, I know some investors who are working with IFC and the World Bank on that. The energy's,
I have a trivia question for you. Which country generates about half of its electricity from geothermal? In Africa, which African country?
I see. I was going to say Iceland. From geothermal, Rwanda seems to run everything pretty well, so I think they could do it. But I think Zambia sits on the biggest aquifer, right? So I guess you can tell.
I don't know. Yeah. So the answer is actually Kenya. Kenya is generating about half of its electricity today off geothermal from plants in the Rift Valley, and Iceland. That was a good little part of the trivia answer. Iceland has assisted them, I think, has advised them, and some of these plants are just up the road, basically from Nairobi in the valley. But that's great. That's awesome because that's like unlimited, right? It doesn't you're going to get, as long as lava is flowing up toward the surface, you're going to get your electricity out of that. The problem with Kenya's had some power cuts because their grid is creaky, and there have been like these breakdowns in the power lines that have took like the entire country down a few months ago for like several hours. But yeah, geothermal, that is the answer. The Kenyans are now helping Ethiopia to try to exploit some of that farther up the valley in the Rift Valley.
Right on. Okay, so we've talked about population growth. We've talked about urbanization. We've talked a little bit about tech. We've talked about democracy, but I think we should go back to tech just for a sec, because I think this is a big story. And one of the ways that tech is transforming Africa is through the from payment systems to financial services. I mean, financial inclusion, unless you've actually kind of looked at the issue, is one of the big impediments to people sort of rising out of poverty. So technology has been a huge factor in people rising into the middle class by having access to financial services. But not only that, tech now is responsible for remote healthcare and remote diagnostics. It's responsible for connecting, so much of the ag stuff happens so far away from the city. And tech helps producers communicate with the markets and also get prices in real time, have weather information. I met an American guy from Idaho, actually, sometime back up in Chipata, which is on the border of Malawi. And he had a whole business up there developing super seeds to create efficiencies in agriculture. And I didn't even understand the business. And he explained it to me. And it's a huge business. And now we're going to have, data centers, Google and Amazon and Yahoo. They're all pushing into the continent to develop data centers. One of the barriers has been connectivity on the planet. Well, there you go, another investment opportunity. And now everybody from Starlink to Facebook to Google to a number of other groups they're in the business of wiring up Africa because they see that as, wiring up eyeballs, wiring up consumers, wiring up, the youth class at the very beginning of their consumer trajectory. You know, you get them young, keep them till they're old.
Lock them down.
The arc of this.
Yeah, that's you know.
Yeah.
Did you know who's been digging or running a fiber across literally the jungles of the DRC in the past year or two? And it's Facebook. They've got. I was on a call where this guy who runs the company that's putting down the fiber is like, we've got like soldiers out there because it's like in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
And across hundreds and hundreds of kilometers to get essentially they're trying to get link, I guess, from western coast of Africa into East Africa, where I guess they have a lot of concentrate. But Facebook really sees Africa as its continent.
That's wild.
And one of the reasons is, as you know, a lot of businesses they don't have websites. They run it on their Facebook page in Africa because often they'll get the data free from their carrier, so they don't have to cut into their data to get on Facebook. And that's just like a genius move by Facebook.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, they've got tremendous loyalty across Africa. And like you say, they're linking up and trying to get more bandwidth into these remote corners of or at least connecting through very remote areas. There's a lot of these more cables that are coming. Facebook's also building one like around the entirety of Africa. Huawei's doing one as well, the Chinese telecom.
Yeah.
So more bandwidth's coming, more speed, and then Google, which is trying to do more in Africa, they're really concerned about trying to get the cost of the data lower because they feel like that's key to getting more people shopping and doing other things. And they feel like the data cost is still quite high. It's not high when it lands, the cable lands over on the coast.
Yeah.
It gets very expensive between there and your phone or your laptop for some reason. That's where the money's kind of getting made.
That makes perfect sense to me because if you think of Congo, DRC, which is 80 million people. You can't even drive from one side to the other because of the jungles and the impassable lakes and rivers and stuff. And in that scenario, laying cable ain't going to be easy, which is why I don't understand how he managed to get his hydrofoil on the Congo River when he took that shot with the flag. It was pretty amazing. Probably had a lot of soldiers.
That's crazy.
Yeah, so that's tech. We can talk about climate change if you feel like it, and migration.
Yeah, I guess we got to talk. We've been talking up the good stuff, and there is so much positive, and often it doesn't get nearly enough attention or emphasis. But there are, you got to be realistic. There are some things on the flip side that aren't so great, and Africa might have the most sunshine available to turn into energy in the world, but it also is getting hit by some of the biggest climate change impacts in the world. And we're seeing that from not just drought, but also super floods and I was going to say typhoons. It's not typhoons, cyclones, hurricane, basically, that are even coming far inland and causing all kinds of destruction, heavy rains, and then extreme heat. A few months ago, I was interviewing a guy in Johannesburg who's an underwriter for a very unique insurance company that was set up. I think it was set up in connection with the African Union, but their business is basically their customers are governments. Their customers are governments who buy the insurance, and then if there's certain things that trigger, they see a sort of climate impacts coming, it will trigger the payout so that they can put that money to like herders or to other people to essentially protect them before the main effects of a drought or whatever come through. But one of the points he made was, he said most people don't realize that extreme heat is one of the biggest threats, and that's and when you start looking into it, it's amazing. People are literally migrating; they're leaving their lands. Because the lands in many places you can't live on there. The heat has become too intense, and there's no relief, and it's undermining their farming or their cattle raising or just being able to survive in those areas. So. Climate's one of those that is, it's got a lot of terrible effects that right now it's a little bit hard to see how those are going to be improved on for the short term.
Yeah, and a lot of people forget that there are a lot of barrier islands that make up the African Union, like Maldives and the Comoros and other islands that are actually quite low in terms of their sea level. And that ties into the last mega trend that the Finnish white paper, Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs wrote, and that was migration. And that ties directly to climate change and, of course, to economic empowerment. A lot of people migrate because of persecution, religious persecution, such as in Burkina Faso or some of the conflict areas like Sudan and whatnot, as well as economic opportunity. We see a lot of in South Africa, for instance. There has been a sort of a new meme, a new populism. That it used to be that Zimbabweans and Botswanans and they were all kind of considered part of the same. These are areas that used to be part of Southern Africa. Even Zambia and Namibia was I think called Southern Africa or Western. I can't remember.
Southwest Africa.
Southwest Africa, yeah. And now they're not so welcome. The new government has basically said they're not going to renew visas for Zimbabweans, and so a lot of people are feeling less and less welcome. And this is all because they think the Zimbabweans are taking the jobs. And Zimbabweans, as a group, are actually generally really well educated and hardworking and really lovely people, actually. So the migration is being driven by climate change, economic opportunity. And what was the last one? Oh, I just said it. Okay.
Well, climate change, though, to also say there's an opportunity there because there will be, I think you mentioned seeds, and there's going to be climate resilient seeds and farm techniques that are being created right now and being field tested and stuff in Africa. There's going to be opportunities to help communities become more resistant or resilient to these climate impacts, whether it's reforesting or creating ways for them to, maybe it's the way houses are built, or maybe it's the way resources are used on the ground, water resources. But there's a lot of opportunities that are going to emerge, I think, around trying to help Africa kind of improve the conditions, because, as you say, it's another instance where Africa didn't create this problem. These industrial emissions, carbon emissions, are a legacy of Europe, a legacy of America and China. And historically, Africa barely contributed any of this, and yet it's bearing a significant brunt of the effects.
Yeah, so true. And then in terms of conflict and economic empowerment, these are it's interesting to see that like Africa is kind of having the same. There's a wave of populism going around the world where everybody thinks everybody else is taking their thing, and you are seeing it here for sure. So those are the 6 buckets. We're on to 57 minutes into the discussion. I just want to take a moment to talk about some of the interesting areas of opportunity. You think a lot about the obvious things, like renewable energies and ag and whatnot. But with this youth bulge that's happening in Africa, there's a lot of quiet opportunities that savvy investors and brands are kind of tuned into. For instance, one boom that we're seeing is in fashion and beauty. The beauty industry is in full effect here. And fashion, obviously, it's a youth demographic, is one of the driving forces of the culture. And that represents a huge opportunity. And a lot of the big brands I'm seeing sort of dip their toes in here, the ones that aren't already here. You probably bought that shirt.
I just consider you're a very fashionable guy, so that makes total sense.
So another one would be.
But it's true. That's a big business. That's a huge and growing business.
It's a huge business, and so I'll go through them a little faster. So building construction supplies in a rapidly urbanizing continent, you're going to see a lot of construction, and most of the millionaires I know in Zambia we're selling hardware, to be honest. It's like the gold rush. If the guy who's going to make the most money at the gold rush is the guy who sells the shovels, right?
Right, shovels in the jeans. Yeah,
Exactly. Then I'm seeing a lot of players in the green revolution, a lot of guys in solar and wind and other topologies. There's a lot of people in Europe descending on South Africa because of the energy crisis and whatnot. And the trend that I'm seeing is people going off grid and kind of not relying on government to solve their energy problems. And so a lot of these big commercial buildings are looking at systems that they can put on the roof and just become their own energy company, so to speak, and pass on the benefits and also the costs to the tenants. And I think you're going to see more of that. If you go from the airport by train to Sandton in Johannesburg or anywhere around Africa, you'd just be amazed at the amount of solar panels you'll see on private homes and stuff. So that's a big trend, and people are aware of it, and everybody wants to save money because it's a very cost-sensitive customer in Africa. The next one, it was really interesting because it speaks to my past, is media and entertainment. I used to be in the media business and did a lot of investments there. But a lot of groups, media companies, content makers, people who own giant catalogs are looking at Africa as a brand new audience with an enormous set of eyeballs and ears. And you're seeing a lot of investment, particularly in South Africa, but also in places like Lagos, Nigeria, which is kind of known as the Black Hollywood, Nollywood. So you got Hollywood, Bollywood, and Nollywood. And Idris Elba, I think I mentioned before, did a JV with Ebony Enterprises, I think, to open up some gigantic studio down there for the sole purpose of generating content for the continent with a Nigerian or an African flavor. And that's what I'm seeing in my network, is that like there is a big appetite for African-centric content, which is a really neat thing to see. And it's a very creative community. And anytime you see that many young people, then you're going to see some exciting things.
A lot of it's music, right? Music, but film is in there too. But music, I mean, in terms of what's reaching around the world, it seems to be.
Yeah, it is
right now. Music, yeah.
So like out of South Africa, they've got a new style called Amapiano, which you're gonna hear all over the discos in Ibiza and Mykonos and whatnot. So and Lagos is known for a great sort of pop sound, as well as DRC and a lot of these other places. So you're absolutely right. Music is a big export from Africa.
Yeah. There's some cool things being done too on television for kids. And some of these have a bit of America. There's one has an American investor behind it doing kids programming, particularly aimed at science and technology, which I think is very cool. Trying to get those kids excited about it. Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. Another bucket is retail. Retail is going to continue to expand, especially into these secondary and tertiary cities. I think the one thing that you'll see alongside of that is more online retail, and you'll know this, Edward, but Amazon delivers here, and usually they don't have a last mile solution, but a lot of people buy stuff on Amazon. They'll have it delivered to sort of one of these. I don't even know what to call them. They're like little post offices that are private sector post.
Like a locker sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think you're going to see a lot more retail brick and mortar, but also there's no ceiling to how high the online retail business can go.
And you don't have to be a mega anything to get into that. I mean, I think Jumia, which is kind of the African. It's actually run out of Germany, but their operations are in Africa. It's sort of the African Amazon, some have called it.
Yeah.
They basically just went out and they've identified all these smaller mom and pop kind of operations, and they kind of consolidate, aggregate their inventory onto their site. So I think that's a lot, and you see people too selling. In fact, the ring light I'm using in this particular broadcast is from somebody who was advertising on Instagram, just showing their stuff on Instagram, and call this number and I'll deliver it. And so there's a lot of a lot of sales that go on just through those channels.
That's amazing. Actually, that's really
yeah.
Another category is education, and I think you have to be here to appreciate how aspirational everybody is. Obviously there's a lot more people than there are jobs, and so people who are trying to enter the formal sector are really, they're almost like certificate and accreditation crazy. They want degrees, higher degrees. They do online courses with UK universities and American universities. If you teach them bartending, they'll want a certificate for it. It's going to go on the CV. And it's turned into just a gigantic business. And I think I shared with you one time that we're in pre-development for a university called Cavendish University. They're doing one in Kampala, and then also one here in Lusaka. And it turned out, just by the by, that the investment group behind it is a private equity group out of DC, and I asked one of the directors, one time I was like, so you guys are in education in Africa. Is that because you're an impact fund, or you're trying to do good and do well at the same time? And it was like a cold-blooded no. We just saw the opportunity. We're chasing yield, and education in Africa is a booming business. And
big business.
Yeah,
big business.
And it's probably going to go.
And there's such hunger for knowledge and for but it's also going the other direction. There's I've seen at least 2 or 3 instances where African entrepreneurs are taking cultural content from their particular countries and repackaging it into an app or into other formats so that they can get it to that new generation, which is not in the village. They're not in the village sitting around the fire listening to the elders tell the stories, right?
Yeah.
They're in the city, and there's got to be some new way to bring that cultural content to them. And there's some people doing some really creative stuff. I ran into one in Ethiopia. I'm aware of one that's being done in Kenya. And I think you're going to see a lot more of that, where people are like, hey, we got tons of content here. We can repackage it so that it gets to those kids who are, basically staring at a screen all day.
Exactly. Just repurpose it. You're exactly right.
Yeah.
So then the obvious
very
ones,
cool.
like, we've got ag and we've got minerals and all those things. But the last one I think I'll talk about is the one I know probably the most about, which is real estate. And in the property sector, I mean, we do commercial property. And one of the biggest commercial real estate classes in the United States is actually multifamily. And so I have, we had a little gig up in one of the mines up in the north once, where we were trying to create affordable housing for mine workers. It was something we were working with First Quantum on, and we were trying to crack the code because there were very strict affordability bans, but there's an infinite market, right? And it was a very hard lift, to be honest, because there are a lot of expectations around your primary house, and people like yards and stuff. That was 10 years ago. And now what I'm noticing is that the youth demographic, the young professionals coming in, they want to be closer to the city. They want to be closer to their jobs. They want to have more time and less commuting time. They want to have more time to build their professional careers. And now they're willing to live in medium density and more dense living arrangements. And that's a very new phenomenon in Africa. You have to appreciate that. People don't want apartments. They want houses, and they'll build one over a long period of time. And that will be the family house, but it's changing. And so now we're actively developing a multifamily concept that will meet the affordability brands and have a very kind of smart design, and will allow people to live closer to where the demand generators are, like the jobs and the schools and the transport corridors and stuff, and just be closer to where everything is. And whether you're doing ESG compliant commercial, single tenant industrial, warehousing, or life sciences centers or data centers, or there are so many niches in the property category for this like exploding population. So that represents a tremendous opportunity. You just have to get the affordability bands right, and you have to get the financing structure correct. Don't come here looking for capital markets. Bring your own adventure. Bring your own money.
Bring your cash. Well, we probably ought to mention, as we're kind of wrapping up, that we have a podcast that's called The Rush for Africa. Now, if you're looking for it, you won't find it. Not yet, but it's about to appear. And there'll be several episodes will appear at once that will that we actually recorded from different locations, right? Some were recorded in Congo, Namibia, Kenya,
Cape Town.
South Africa. So you get a taste of different places as we do that. As we wrap up here, is there any besides those property opportunities, anything else you're kind of paying attention to as we wind up?
You know, I'm paying a lot of attention to the green minerals sector at the moment. A lot of attention to that because I can see a lot of movement in that space, and I happen to be in Zambia, which is kind of the heart of this of the mineral belt in southern Africa, along with Katanga province up in DRC. And it's a really exciting space. I think there are going to be a lot of fortunes to be made, and I think a lot of that wealth will stay in country. How about you? What are you noticing? What are you working on?
Digging stuff out of the ground in Zambia like a treasure chest. I'm working on different things, but one that's one thing I'm just watching because I think it's really fascinating and it plays into this. One of our mega trends is that Africa's voice on the world stage is, I think, getting a lot more attention. And that also came out of, I think, COVID to some degree, the realization that Africa needed to be much more at the table.
Yeah.
And we now have both the US and China saying, yes, Africa should be sitting at the table of the group of 20 major economies every time that meets. So I think that's a positive. We've also seen the African Union going up and having direct discussions with Putin on making sure the food supply, the grain supply was not blocked coming out of Ukraine,
Right.
because that's very important to Africa. And so the African Union was actually speaking with kind of one voice for Africa. So we're going to see that in other contexts. But and also, of course, we have two Africans running two major international organizations. One who Ethiopian who runs the World Health Organization and kind of shepherded us through the crisis of the pandemic. And was a former health minister in Ethiopia, and then the former finance minister of Nigeria, who runs the World Trade Organization. Hope she can be helpful in getting that free trade area cranking. But I think those are good signs. Those are positive signs of Africa. It's 6 decades, but Africa is beginning now to assert itself in ways that I think are going to be incredibly positive in the years ahead.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's very exciting to be here as we see all these positive changes, even amidst the challenges. And so I want to put a plug in for your book, the award-winning Last Days in Naked Valley, which is available on Amazon. You go to Ed's LinkedIn page, and I'm sure you'll see a link there. I think he's got a tattoo of the book on his LinkedIn profile portrait. And I have the book, The Internationalist, which is on Amazon as well. You can check it out. I also want to say that Ed and I we're both in country. We spend most of our time here, and feel free to reach out to either of us if you have anything you want to chat about regarding strategy, geopolitics, investment entry points. Part of the reason we do this is to expand our network and share what we know through the hard grafting we've done on the ground over the last 10 years. So with that, Edward, do you have any closing remarks you want to offer?
I think you've done a beautiful job there to close us out. And yeah, we see that there's a need for a lot more people to better understand what's happening here. And that's why we're doing this and other things and the podcast to help the audiences outside of Africa to understand there are risks, yes, but there are also opportunities, and to understand the context and that there's a lot of positive stuff happening in Africa, and we want to share that with you.
All right. Thank you so much, Edward and Africa. It's great to see
Thanks,
you.
CJ.
Boys, enjoy Nairobi, and hopefully I'll see you next time from Cape Town. We're signing off on this
Take care.
side. All right. Thank you, everybody.